Hey honey, you look worried. What is on your mind?
Earlier I met with a client who was on trial for attempted murder. He tried to run over an ex-girlfriend when he saw her coming out of a bar with another man. Fortunately, he didn't hurt her thanks to the telephone poles and trash cans that kept him from killing her. He's not a good person and believes he can get away with anything.
He sounds like a stalker and a psychopath.
His demeanor makes me feel uncomfortable. He has a criminal record that includes assaults and robberies. As we were going over his case, to try to find some mitigating circumstances, he asks me if our conversation is strictly confidential, and I assure him that I have a duty to keep anything he tells me private. Then, he admits that this was not the first time he tried to teach a woman a lesson. 10 years prior, he had accidentally killed a female he dated and that someone else was charged with the crime and is currently in prison serving a life sentence.
That is wrong. What can you do about this? You cannot let an innocent person remain in prison knowing the truth.
I know, this is an ethical dilemma that has created conflicting duties. The bar sets out a code of ethics and professional conduct that all attorneys must adhere to. It explicitly says that I have a duty to protect the interests of my client, and unless there was imminent threat to someone's life, this rule cannot be ignored.
But don't you have a moral obligation under the categorical imperative to help others?
I have no legal duty to the guy that is currently in prison for a crime he did not commit. However, as a human being and advocate for justice, having this knowledge disturbs me as it goes against my personal maxim, which is to protect and defend the innocent.
You mean to tell me that you will just an innocent man rot in prison? And allow a killer to get away with murder?
I have several options. To continue representing my client as I normally would. To withdraw representation, which I couldn't do for any reason. Or, report it, which is against the State Bar Code of Ethics. Attorney-client privilege strictly prohibits the attorney from reporting the admission of a past crime.
How would these take into consideration the categorical imperative of respect for all persons?
If I were to continue to represent my client, I will be showing him dignity and respect. And under the categorical imperative of respecting all persons, it also applies to criminals. The criminal behavior does not take away a person's dignity. Even then, they are entitled to a fair trial, legal representation, right to appeal, and humane prison conditions. On the other hand, withdrawing representation will show respect for the individual who was wrongfully convicted. Under the categorical rule, I have a moral obligation to be helpful to people regardless of how it affects me. The American Bar Association Code of Ethics only requires that in this situation I try to convince my client to come forward and admit his guilt so that the innocent man can be freed, which I did and my client declined. Unfortunately, there is nothing I can do for the wrongly convicted without harming my client.
Will it use anyone as a means to an end? How about that poor fella who is paying for someone else's crime? Isn't he using him?
In representing my client, I will not be using anyone because the client is on trial for a totally different case. However, if I withdraw representation, I will be using my client to help my own conscience. And deny him of my professional legal services as well as his right to due process. Essentially, I will be avoiding my duty and do him a disservice as he will have to obtain a new lawyer, which can hinder his defense. If I report it, I would be using my client to save the wrongly convicted and prevent him from hurting others. But I would be in violation of our code of ethics and face disbarment.
Wow. That's tough. This guy sounds like he is a danger to society. Which option would fulfill the universal maxim?
If I continue to represent my client, the maxim would be I ought to provide legal representation to my clients whether they are innocent or guilty. The attorney-client confidentiality is a maxim that has been universally applied. With explicit exceptions, this rule has to remain intact for the sanctity of the establishment. If attorneys begin to deviate from it, people will lose faith in the legal system as they will not trust that anything they tell their attorney will be kept confidential and ultimately hurt the legal community. If you can't trust your lawyer, whose job is to defend you, then who can you trust? The other option of not representing the client simply because they might be guilty cannot be universally applied because many clients are guilty and they still need representation. Not to mention that it will erode the very foundation on which our legal system is built.
Sounds like the State Bar has already determined how you should proceed.
You're right. I'll have to do my job and provide my client with the best possible defense. Thanks, hon.